Can I ask you to give me your name, please?
Peter Tobin.
You're going to be asked questions about the abduction of Vicky Hamilton.
Tobin didn't just take my daughter away, he took my life away.
I was a police officer for 34 years, and in that long career, I never met anyone as evil and dangerous as Peter Tobin.
Looking at Angelika's injuries, it was apparent to me, even as someone who's not a pathologist, that this was a violent death. She'd been stabbed multiple times, her hands were bound, she had a gag in her mouth, she had tape wrapped around her face, her clothing was on, but her upper clothing was pushed up and her trousers were unfastened. So it all sort of backed up that this was a sexually motivated murder, and you could see the extent of the violence.
Between 1991 and 2006, at least 3 young women were murdered in Scotland. 4 years, these deaths seemed unconnected, different locations, different circumstances, different police investigations. But they all shared one connection: a handyman named Peter Tobin who moved from place to place, leaving destruction in his wake. Tobin's eventual conviction raised a disturbing question that remains unanswered today. Were there more victims? Police identified over 40 unsolved cases that might be connected to his movements across the UK. Some investigators believe the real number could be much higher. This is the story of how one man exploited trust, mobility, and systemic gaps to harm vulnerable women, and why the full scope of his crimes may never be known.
Peter Tobin was born on August 27, 1946, in Johnstone, Renfrewshire, Scotland. His early life was marked by instability and violence. He grew up in a troubled household and displayed concerning behavior from a young age. By his teenage years, he had already begun a pattern of criminal activity that would continue throughout his life. Tobin's adult life was characterized by frequent moves across the UK, multiple marriages, and a string of convictions for various offenses. He worked primarily as a handyman, a job that gave him access to people's homes and allowed him to move between communities without attracting suspicion. This mobility would later become a crucial factor in understanding the potential scope of his crimes. Throughout his life, Tobin was known to be charming when it suited him, able to gain people's trust despite his violent tendencies. He had been married 3 times, and each marriage ended amid allegations of abuse and violence. His former wives would later describe a man capable of extreme rage and control, someone who presented one face to the world while hiding something far darker. His first marriage was in 1969, and within that relationship, patterns of controlling and violent behavior emerged that would characterize all his relationships with women. His second wife reported being subjected to physical violence, and by the time of his third marriage in the 1990s, the violence had escalated to include weapons. These relationships left a trail of traumatized women who had survived encounters with Tobin, though many others would not be so fortunate. By the time of his first murder conviction, Tobin had a criminal record that included burglary, assault, and a conviction for sexual assault on 2 teenage girls in 1993. He served 10 years in prison for that offense, being released in 2004. Just 2 years after his release, he would commit the murder that would finally expose him as one of Scotland's most dangerous killers. On September 24, 2006, 23-year-old Angelika Kluk disappeared from St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow, where she had been helping with cleaning work. Angelika was a Polish student who had come to Scotland to improve her English and earn money during her university break. She was known as a friendly, hard-working young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. Angelika had been studying languages at university in Gdansk, Poland, and had dreams of becoming a teacher. Her family described her as someone who loved learning and was excited about the opportunities that studying abroad could offer. She had arrived in Scotland full of optimism, eager to experience a new culture and improve her language skills. She had found work through connections in the Polish community and was saving money to continue her education. Peter Tobin had been working at the church as a handyman, going by the name Pat McLaughlin. He had ingratiated himself with the church community, presenting himself as a helpful, reliable worker. No one suspected that he was a convicted sex offender living under a false identity. The church had provided him with accommodation in the building itself, giving him constant access to the premises and anyone who worked there. When Angelika went missing, police launched an immediate investigation. Her disappearance was completely out of character. She had been in regular contact with her family and had plans for the future. The last person known to have seen her was Tobin. Church staff reported that Tobin's behavior had changed dramatically after Angelika's disappearance. He had become agitated and had left Glasgow suddenly, claiming he needed to visit family in England. 6 days after her disappearance, police made a horrific discovery. Angelika's body was found hidden beneath the floorboards of the church, near the confessional. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and stabbed multiple times. The location of her body, in a place of worship where she had gone to work honestly, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating crime. Tobin had fled Glasgow immediately after the murder, traveling to London where he was eventually arrested on September 4, 2006. During his arrest, he gave police a false name and tried to maintain his alternate identity, but investigators quickly established who he really was. When arrested, he had injuries to his hands that were consistent with a violent struggle. The trial began in April 2007 at the High Court in Edinburgh. The evidence against Tobin was overwhelming. DNA evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis all pointed to his guilt. Prosecutors presented evidence that Tobin had researched methods of concealing bodies and had purchased materials consistent with those used to wrap Angelika's body. Despite mounting evidence, Tobin maintained his innocence throughout the trial, showing no emotion as testimony about Angelika's final hours was presented. On May 4, 2007, Peter Tobin was found guilty of the murder of Angelika Kluk. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 21 years. Judge Lord Menzies described the crime as one of utmost depravity, and noted that Tobin had shown absolutely no remorse. But this conviction would prove to be just the beginning of a much larger investigation. Following Tobin's conviction for Angelika's murder, police began investigating his background more thoroughly. They were particularly interested in a property in Bathgate, West Lothian, where Tobin had lived during the early 1990s. Acting on intelligence and historical records, investigators obtained permission to excavate the garden of the property. The decision to excavate was not taken lightly. It required significant resources and was based on circumstantial evidence and patterns in Tobin's behavior rather than specific information about victims being buried there. Detective Superintendent David Swindle, who led the investigation, later described the decision as one of the most difficult of his career, knowing that they might find nothing or might uncover horrors that would devastate multiple families. In November 2007, police made a discovery that would link Tobin to a cold case that had remained unsolved for 16 years. Human remains were found buried in the garden. Forensic analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Vicky Hamilton, a 15-year-old girl who had disappeared in February 1991. Vicky had been last seen at a bus stop in Bathgate after visiting her sister in Livingston. She was trying to get home to Reading near Falkirk but never arrived. For 16 years, her family had lived with the agony of not knowing what had happened to her. Her disappearance had been one of Scotland's most high-profile missing person cases, with regular appeals and searches that had yielded nothing. Vicky's mother, Jeanette, had never given up hope of finding her daughter. She had campaigned tirelessly to keep Vicky's case in the public eye, appearing in media appeals and working with police on every new lead. The discovery of Vicky's remains brought both closure and renewed grief to her family. Jeanette later said that while she had always hoped Vicky might be found alive, knowing the truth was better than continuing to live in uncertainty. The discovery of Vicky's remains brought both closure and renewed grief to her family. Further investigation revealed that she had been held captive, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Her body had been dismembered and hidden in the garden of Tobin's former home. The forensic examination suggested that Vicky had been held alive for some time before being killed, adding another layer of horror to her ordeal. The excavation of Tobin's former property yielded another tragic discovery. Along with Vicky Hamilton's remains, police found the body of another young woman, 18-year-old Dinah McNicol. Dinah had disappeared in August 1991 while hitchhiking home to Essex after attending a music festival in Hampshire. She had been traveling with friends but decided to hitchhike part of the way home, a decision that would cost her her life. For 16 years, her family had hoped she was alive somewhere, perhaps living a different life. The discovery of her remains ended that hope but provided answers they had desperately needed. Dinah had been a bright, adventurous young woman who loved music and was looking forward to starting university. Her family described her as spirited and independent, someone who embraced life fully. After her disappearance, her parents had maintained a bedroom for her, keeping it exactly as she had left it, hoping she might one day return. The discovery that she had been murdered so soon after her disappearance was devastating. Like Vicky Hamilton, Dinah had been held captive, sexually assaulted, and murdered before being buried in Tobin's garden. The fact that two young women from different parts of the UK had ended up buried in the same location pointed to a predator who had been operating for years without detection. The investigation revealed that Tobin had likely picked up Dinah while she was hitchhiking. He had been driving through the area at the time and would have appeared as just another motorist offering a lift to a young person trying to get home. Once Dinah was in his vehicle, she would have had no way of escaping. In December 2008, Peter Tobin was convicted of murdering both Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNicol. He received 2 more life sentences, with the judge recommending that he should never be released from prison. Lord Emsley, the presiding judge, described Tobin as evil, and noted that he had shown no remorse for any of his crimes. The judge also commended the families of both victims for their dignity throughout the trial process. The conviction of Peter Tobin for 3 murders raised an urgent question for law enforcement. Were there more victims? Tobin's extensive travel history, his pattern of using false identities, and the long gap between his known crimes suggested that he might have been responsible for other unsolved murders. In response, police launched Operation Anagram, one of the most extensive cold case reviews in UK history. Investigators compiled a list of more than 40 unsolved murders and disappearances of young women that occurred in locations where Tobin had lived or was known to have traveled. The operation involved officers from multiple police forces across Scotland and England, working together to review decades of case files. The investigation was complicated by several factors. Tobin had moved frequently throughout his life, living in various locations across Scotland and England. He often used false names and avoided leaving paper trails. Additionally, during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, police forces across the UK operated more independently, making it difficult to identify patterns that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Investigators used a variety of methods to try to track Tobin's movements. They reviewed electoral registers, benefit records, employment records, and interviewed hundreds of people who had known Tobin at various points in his life. They also examined his financial records, looking for unexplained trips or periods where his whereabouts were unclear. One case that drew particular attention was the Bible John murders, a series of 3 killings in Glasgow during the late 1960s in which young women were murdered after meeting a man at the Barrowland Ballroom. The killer was never caught, and investigators noted some similarities between those crimes and Tobin's known offenses. Tobin would have been in his early 20s at the time, living in the Glasgow area. A DNA comparison was conducted, but the results were inconclusive due to the degraded nature of the historical evidence. However, despite extensive investigation, no definitive links were established between Tobin and the Bible John murders or any of the other cold cases examined under Operation Anagram. Tobin himself refused to cooperate with investigators, declining to provide information about his movements or activities during the relevant time periods. When offered the opportunity to clear his name regarding cases he was not involved in, he refused, seeming to prefer that suspicion remain. Operation Anagram highlighted the significant challenges involved in investigating historical crimes. Many of the cases being examined occurred before modern forensic techniques like DNA analysis were available. Physical evidence from crime scenes had often been lost, destroyed, or degraded over time. Witnesses had died or their memories had faded after decades. Additionally, police record-keeping in the 1970s and 1980s was not as comprehensive or digitized as it is today. Piecing together Tobin's movements during those decades required painstaking research through paper records, old electoral rolls, and witness interviews. The investigation also revealed systemic issues in how information was shared between police forces. In several instances, Tobin had come to the attention of police in different jurisdictions for various offenses, but that information was not centrally coordinated in a way that might have identified him as a potential serial offender earlier. If modern information sharing systems had existed in the 1990s, investigators believed Tobin might have been identified as a high-risk individual much sooner, potentially saving lives. Throughout his time in prison, Peter Tobin remained largely silent about his crimes. He refused to provide any information that might help investigators solve cold cases or bring closure to other families. This refusal was described by detectives as a final act of control, denying victims' families the answers they desperately sought. Some investigators who interviewed Tobin believed he took pleasure in withholding information, enjoying the power it gave him even from behind bars. Others suggested he might have been protecting himself from additional convictions, though given his multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, this reasoning seems less convincing. On October 8, 2022, Peter Tobin died at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh at the age of 76. His death meant that any information he might have possessed about other potential victims died with him. For families of missing women from the time periods when Tobin was active, His death represented the end of any hope for answers. The Peter Tobin case has had significant implications for how law enforcement approaches serial offender investigations in the UK. It demonstrated the importance of information sharing between police forces and the value of maintaining comprehensive databases of unsolved crimes that can be cross-referenced when patterns emerge. Following the Tobin case, police forces across the UK enhanced their systems for tracking repeat offenders and sharing information about unsolved crimes. The VI-class Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System database was expanded, allowing investigators to identify patterns across different jurisdictions more effectively. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young women, particularly those who were traveling or in transitional situations. Vicky Hamilton was trying to get home from visiting family. Dinah McNicol was hitchhiking after a music festival. Angelika Kluk was working to support her education. All three were doing ordinary things that should not have put them in danger, yet they encountered a predator who exploited their vulnerability. For the families of Tobin's confirmed victims, the convictions brought a measure of justice but could never compensate for their losses. Vicky Hamilton's mother, Jeanette, became an advocate for families of missing persons, working to support others going through similar ordeals. Angelika Kluk's family established a foundation in Poland to support young people, turning their grief into something positive. Despite 3 murder convictions and extensive investigation, fundamental questions about Peter Tobin remain unanswered. How many victims were there really? Did he kill only these 3 women, or were there others whose remains have never been found or whose cases were never connected to him? Some investigators believe Tobin may have been responsible for as many as 20 murders over several decades. Others are more conservative in their estimates, suggesting that while additional victims are possible, the evidence to support such high numbers is limited. The gap between Tobin's known crimes is also puzzling. His first known murder was in 1991, and there is no confirmed evidence of him killing anyone between then and 2006, a 15-year period. This seems unusual for someone who investigators believe may have been a serial killer. Was he inactive during this period? Were there victims whose cases have not been connected to him? Or was he simply more careful during those years, avoiding detection? The reality is that we may never know the full truth about Peter Tobin's crimes. What we do know is that he was a dangerous predator who exploited trust, mobility, and systemic weaknesses to harm vulnerable people. His 3 confirmed victims, Angelika Kluk, Vicky Hamilton, and Dinah McNicol, represent lives cut tragically short and families forever changed by his actions. Peter Tobin's case serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance, information sharing between law enforcement agencies, and the need to take seriously any reports of concerning behavior. It also highlights the ongoing challenge of solving cold cases and the frustration of families who may never receive the answers they seek. The 3 women he murdered deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. Their cases led to important improvements in how police investigate and track potential serial offenders, changes that may help protect others in the future. As for the unanswered questions about other potential victims, they remain open. Police continue to review cold cases, and families of missing women from the relevant time periods continue to wonder if their loved ones might have crossed paths with Peter Tobin. His death has closed one chapter, but the full story of his crimes may never be completely written.